The city believed it was protected by history. For nearly 500 years, Baghdad had been more than a capital. It had been a symbol, the seat of the Abbasid caliphs, the city of scholars, poets, judges, merchants, libraries, palaces, canals, and arguments that crossed continents. Its political power had risen and fallen. Its rulers had been challenged, overshadowed, and sometimes reduced. But the name still carried extraordinary weight. And then in 1258, a Mongol army arrived. The caliph still held a title that sounded enormous. He was the heir of a dynasty that had once ruled from North Africa to Central Asia. He lived in a city whose name still carried a kind of sacred political thunder. But thunder is not the same as an army. And when Baghdad finally fell, the world learned a brutal lesson. Prestige cannot stop siege engines. Memory cannot hold a wall. And a ruler who mistakes symbolic authority for real power may discover the difference only when it is too late. Welcome to the History Docket, where history's greatest disasters are reopened. Before we enter Baghdad, take a moment to like this episode, subscribe to the channel, and leave your verdict in the comments as the case unfolds. Because this is not simply the story of Mongol cruelty or Abbasid weakness. It is a case about miscalculation, arrogance, isolation, political blindness, and the terrible moment when an old empire realizes that many who still revere it no longer fear for it enough to save it. This is the case of the fall of Baghdad, the last Abbasid caliph in the city. The Mongol prince sent west with an army of terrifying discipline. The advisors who disagreed while the danger approached. The letters that became threats. The warnings answered with pride. And the decisions that left one of the greatest cities of the medieval world dangerously unprepared before the most effective war machine of its age. Chapter 1: The City of Peace. Baghdad began with a name that now sounds almost unbearably tragic. Madinat al-Salam, the City of Peace. It was founded in the 8th century by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, not as a random settlement but as a statement. A new dynasty needed a new center. The Abbasids had overthrown the Umayyads and wanted a capital worthy of their ambition. Baghdad rose near the Tigris, close to ancient roots, fertile lands, and the arteries of empire. It was planned, imagined, and built as a seat of universal rule. In its greatest centuries, Baghdad was not merely rich, it was intellectually electric. Scholars translated Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syriac works into Arabic. Mathematicians argued over numbers and astronomy. Physicians wrote and studied. Poets competed for patronage. Theologians debated law, reason, revelation, free will, and power. Merchants brought goods from China, India, Africa, and the Mediterranean. The city was not a museum of knowledge. It was a living machine of exchange. But by the 13th century, the Baghdad of memory and the Baghdad of reality were not the same city. That distinction is the first key to the case. The Abbasid caliphs still possessed immense religious and symbolic prestige. Their names were invoked. Their legitimacy mattered. Their court still carried the aura of ancient authority. In Iraq itself, the Abbasids had recovered some room for action after long periods of domination by stronger military powers. But they were not the masters of the world their title implied. For centuries, real military power had often belonged to others. Provincial dynasties, military commanders, sultans, and regional rulers who might honor the caliph in language while ignoring him in practice. The Abbasid Caliphate had survived, but its survival had often depended on adaptation, negotiation, and the ability to remain useful to stronger powers. Baghdad still mattered, but it no longer commanded the world around it. That is a dangerous condition for any state, powerful enough to attract enemies, too weak to deter them, and prestigious enough to tempt its ruler into believing that old authority can substitute for present strength. By the mid-13th century, the city also faced practical vulnerabilities. Floods, neglect, political instability, and the long decline of older irrigation and defensive systems had damaged the region's resilience. The lands around Baghdad were still valuable, but they were no longer the secure imperial heartland of Abbasid legend. The caliphate's military capacity was limited. Its politics were divided. And outside the old Abbasid sphere, new powers were rising. The greatest of those powers had come from the steppe. The Mongols. By the time Baghdad became their target, the Mongols were not a rumor. They were not a distant tribe. They were an imperial force that had already smashed kingdoms, reorganized trade routes, destroyed resisting cities, and absorbed engineers, administrators, soldiers, and specialists from across Eurasia. This is one of the fatal misunderstandings in the story. Some enemies can be treated as raiders. The Mongols could not. Some invaders come to plunder and leave. The Mongols could also govern, tax, incorporate, and return. Some threats can be delayed by ceremony. The Mongols measured obedience in submission, tribute, hostages, military support, and open gates. Baghdad's tragedy was not that it had no warning. Baghdad's tragedy was that the warning had been visible for decades. Chapter 2: The Empire of Motion. The Mongol Empire did not conquer because it was simply more savage than its enemies. That explanation is too lazy. It conquered because it was fast, disciplined, adaptive, ruthless, and strategically intelligent. Its armies could move across vast distances with shocking coordination. They used intelligence networks, scouts, engineers, siege experts, psychological warfare, and a political system that turned surrender into survival and resistance into an example. They were terrifying, not only because they destroyed cities. They were terrifying because they made destruction part of policy. A city that submitted might be spared, taxed, and integrated. A city that resisted might be devastated in order to teach the next city to open its gates. This did not mean every Mongol campaign was identical. It did not mean every account of massacre should be accepted without caution. Medieval numbers are often exaggerated. Chroniclers wrote with grief, fear, propaganda, and moral purpose. But the pattern of Mongol warfare was clear enough to terrify contemporaries. Obedience could save you. Defiance could destroy you. In the 1250s, the great Khan Mongol ordered a major Western campaign. The man chosen to lead it was Hulegu, a grandson of Genghis Khan and brother of the great Khan. His mission was not a raid. It was a program of imperial consolidation. He was sent to bring the region firmly under Mongol authority, and among his targets were the Nizari Ismailis, famous in Western legend as the Assassins, and the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. Hulegu did not arrive alone. He came with a massive army, reinforced by troops and specialists from across the Mongol world and its subject peoples. Siege engineers, Armenian and Georgian contingents, Turkic and Persian elements, Mongol cavalry, and commanders with experience in campaigns across Asia all formed part of the larger military machine. The exact numbers are debated, as medieval armies are notoriously difficult to count, but the essential point is not the precise total. Hulegu brought enough force to make resistance by an isolated Baghdad extraordinarily dangerous. Before Baghdad, there was Alamut. The Nizari Ismaili fortresses had long been associated with mountain strongholds, political assassination, and defiance of larger powers. In 1256, Hulegu's campaign against them reached a decisive stage. Their power was broken, and their famous fortress network was dismantled, surrendered, or absorbed. To Baghdad, this should have been a thunderclap. The Mongols had not been stopped by mountains. They had not been stopped by reputation. They had not been stopped by the mystique of a feared enemy. And once the Nizari Ismailis were neutralized, Hulegu's attention could turn more directly toward the caliph. The Abbasid court was not unaware of the threat. Letters moved. Demands were made. Diplomacy began. But diplomacy between the Mongols and their targets had a special character. To the Mongols, negotiation was often not a conversation between equals. It was a test of submission. Would the ruler acknowledge the great Khan's supremacy? Would he provide troops? Would he pay tribute? Would he come in person or send the proper officials and demonstrate obedience? For rulers accustomed to their own dignity, this could be intolerable. For rulers without the military power to refuse, it could be fatal. The Abbasid Caliph al-Musta'sim now faced the central question of his reign. Was Hulegu a danger to be placated, a barbarian to be dismissed, or an imperial force that required immediate and humiliating realism? The survival of Baghdad depended on choosing correctly. Chapter 3: The Last Caliph of Baghdad. Al-Musta'sim was not the worst ruler in history. That matters. Disaster stories become too neat when we turn the central figure into a fool, a coward, or a villain. He was a caliph raised inside a court that still radiated spiritual and ceremonial power. He inherited a title older than many kingdoms. He sat in a city whose name still inspired reverence across the Islamic world. But the problem with inherited grandeur is that it trains the mind in dangerous habits. A ruler who grows up surrounded by symbols may begin to believe that symbols are defenses. A ruler addressed with reverence may assume that reverence will translate into military support. A ruler inside an old capital may mistake age for strength. Al-Musta'sim's court was divided. Advisors offered conflicting counsel. Some urged caution, tribute, and negotiation. Others favored defiance. Later sources would place special blame on the vizier Ibn al-Alqami, often accusing him of treachery and secret sympathy with the Mongols. But those accusations must be handled carefully. Sectarian politics shaped many later accounts. Ibn al-Alqami was a Shia vizier serving a Sunni Abbasid caliph, and later writers had reasons to turn him into a convenient villain. The safer verdict is this: the court was divided, the leadership was indecisive, and the caliph failed to create a coherent policy while the strongest army in the world moved toward him. That is already enough to condemn his rule. A state facing annihilation cannot afford a court where rival advisors cancel each other into paralysis. There were rational arguments for avoiding total submission. The Abbasid Caliphate had prestige. To humble the caliph before a non-Muslim conqueror would shock many believers. There was also the hope that the wider Islamic world might respond. Egypt, Syria, the Jazirah, Anatolia, perhaps rulers who had their own rivalries might still understand that Baghdad was too important to abandon. But this hope was weak. The Muslim world was fragmented. The Ayyubid principalities in Syria were divided and cautious. The Mamluks in Egypt had their own concerns and were still consolidating power. They would soon emerge as the major force capable of resisting the Mongols, but in 1258 Baghdad could not rely on a united rescue. Regional rulers might respect the caliph, but respect does not always march. This is one of the cruelest truths in politics. Prestige can make people mourn your fall. It does not guarantee that they will prevent it. Hulegu expected submission. Al-Musta'sim answered with a mixture of delay, pride, and inadequate concession. According to the standard tradition, the caliph's replies included warnings that if Baghdad were attacked, the whole Muslim world would rise. Whether every word preserved by chroniclers is exact or dramatized, the political message was clear. Al-Musta'sim tried to speak with the voice of an empire he no longer possessed. Hulegu was not impressed. The Mongols had heard threats before. They had destroyed rulers who believed their cities were too holy, too famous, too remote, or too prestigious to fall. Baghdad was now moving from diplomacy toward siege. Chapter 4: The Letters Before the Storm. The exchange between Hulegu and Al-Musta'sim has the structure of a tragedy because both sides were communicating from different worlds. Hulegu spoke from the logic of Mongol Empire. Submit, assist, obey, and survive. Resist, delay, insult, and be destroyed. Al-Musta'sim spoke from the logic of caliphal prestige. I am not a provincial lord. I am not a mountain chief. I am the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. But the battlefield does not measure dignity. It measures force, preparation, alliances, morale, supplies, walls, and command. Baghdad's command structure was weak. The city did have soldiers. It did have walls. It did have people willing to fight. It was not an empty symbol. But against Hulegu's army, with its siege equipment and surrounding forces, Baghdad needed disciplined leadership and serious preparation long before the Mongols arrived. Instead, the caliph appears to have misread the moment again and again. He did not submit early enough to avoid attack. He did not prepare strongly enough to resist. He did not rally a reliable coalition. He did not abandon the city. He did not transform Baghdad into a fortress capable of surviving a major siege. He did not treat the Mongol threat as existential until the existential moment had already arrived. This is the fatal middle ground in history, too proud to surrender, too weak to fight. Hulegu advanced into Iraq. The Mongol forces approached from multiple directions. Their commanders coordinated movements around the city and along the river systems. They understood that Baghdad's geography mattered. The Tigris, canals, dikes, and floodplains were not scenery. They were part of the battlefield. Before the main siege, Abbasid forces attempted to resist outside the city. There was a sortie, there was fighting, there was still courage among the defenders. But courage without strategic command can become a sacrifice offered to someone else's mistake. Some accounts describe Mongol forces using waterways and dikes to trap or flood Abbasid troops after fighting outside the city. The details vary, as they often do in medieval siege narratives, but the broader result is clear. Baghdad's forces failed to stop the Mongol approach. The defenders were pushed back. The city was isolated. The ring tightened. Inside Baghdad, the old confidence must have begun to break. There are moments when a city can still tell itself that danger is outside the walls. Then there is the moment when everyone understands that outside the walls is the only world left. Chapter 5: The Siege Begins. A siege is not only a military event. It is a psychological transformation. A city that once opened itself to trade, pilgrims, scholars, officials, and messengers suddenly becomes a sealed body. Gates close, rumors multiply, food becomes strategy, water becomes anxiety. Every sound beyond the walls grows meaning. Every commander's decision becomes public fear. Every delay becomes accusation. Baghdad in January 1258 was not merely waiting for an attack. It was waiting to learn whether its own history still had power. The Mongols surrounded the city. They brought siege engines. They cut off escape. They pressed the walls. The defenders resisted, but the balance was cruel. Hulagu's army had the advantage in numbers, organization, engineering, and momentum. Baghdad had walls, inhabitants, a caliph, and memory. Memory was not enough. The siege was short. That fact is striking. Great cities can take months or years to fall when well prepared, well supplied, and well led. Baghdad did not. The city's defenses were undermined by military pressure, political confusion, and years of inadequate preparation. The Mongols did not need to starve it for a generation. They needed to break the structure of resistance. And perhaps the city was already broken before the walls gave way. The caliph had no credible rescue coming. The court had no unified answer. The defenders had no clear path to victory. The Mongols had every incentive to make an example. This is where the case becomes more than the failure of one man. Baghdad had lived for generations with a widening gap between symbolic greatness and military reality. Al-Musta'sim did not create that gap by himself, but he ruled at the moment when the gap was tested. And when history tests a weakness long enough ignored, it often looks sudden only to those who refuse to measure it. The Mongols opened negotiations. Or more precisely, they continued the pressure that had always been part military and part diplomatic. Surrender might still save some lives. It might preserve some institutions. It might allow the caliph to live as a reduced figure under Mongol authority. But after the previous refusals, delays, and threats, trust had evaporated. Hulegu did not come to Baghdad to admire its past. He came to settle the question of obedience. And Baghdad had given the wrong answer for too long. Chapter 6: The Gates Open. In February 1258, Baghdad surrendered. The exact sequence of the final days is described differently across sources, but the outcome is not in doubt. The caliph came out, officials came out, the city passed into Mongol hands. And then the catastrophe began. The sack of Baghdad is one of those events where the historical imagination becomes almost apocalyptic. Later retellings speak of rivers black with ink from destroyed books and red with blood from the dead. They speak of libraries burned, scholars killed, canals ruined, streets filled with bodies, and the end of an age. Some of these images may be literary exaggerations. The black ink in the Tigris is famous, but it is best treated as symbolic rather than as a precise eyewitness measurement. It expresses something real, the destruction of books, learning, and institutions, but we should be careful not to turn poetic memory into documentary fact. The numbers of the dead are also uncertain. Medieval sources often give enormous figures, and later traditions sometimes increase them. Modern historians tend to treat exact casualty totals with caution. What can be said responsibly is this: the killing was massive, the destruction severe, and the psychological shock enormous. Baghdad was looted. Many inhabitants were killed. The Abbasid political order in the city was destroyed. The caliphate that had ruled from Baghdad since the 8th century came to an end there. Al-Musta'sim was executed. The details of his death became part of legend. A famous story says he was rolled in a carpet and trampled because Mongols avoided spilling royal blood. Whether that precise detail is fully reliable or shaped by later storytelling, the essential fact remains. The last Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad died in Mongol custody. There is something almost unbearably symbolic in that ending. A ruler who had trusted too much in the force of his title was stripped of the world that gave the title meaning. The man who had spoken as if the Muslim world would rise for him died without the rescue he imagined. The city that had once represented the center of a vast civilization was reduced to a warning. For Hulegu, the message was clear. Defy the Mongol Empire, and even Baghdad can fall. For the region, the message was more complicated. If Baghdad could be destroyed, what could not be destroyed? Chapter 7: What was lost? It is tempting to say that the sack of Baghdad ended the Islamic Golden Age. The phrase is common, it is dramatic, it is powerful. It is also too simple. Civilizations do not have a single light switch. Knowledge did not disappear from the Islamic world in 1 week. Scholarship continued in Cairo, Damascus, Tabriz, Maragha, Samarkand, and elsewhere. Persian, Arabic, Turkish, and other intellectual traditions remained vibrant. The Mongols themselves would eventually patronize scholars, convert in different regions, and become part of the worlds they conquered. So no, the fall of Baghdad did not erase Islamic civilization. But it did matter enormously. It ended the Abbasid Caliphate as a ruling power in its historic capital. It shattered one of the most important symbolic centers of the medieval Islamic world. It damaged institutions, families, libraries, neighborhoods, irrigation systems, and networks of patronage. It transformed the political map of Iraq and the wider region. It marked the arrival of Mongol power not as a distant threat, but as a ruling reality. The Abbasid Caliphate would continue in another form. A shadow Abbasid Caliphate was later established in Cairo under Mamluk protection. But that was not the same thing. It was an echo, not the old center. Baghdad itself did not vanish forever. Cities are stubborn. People return, markets reopen, administrators count taxes, craftsmen rebuild, children are born among ruins. Memory changes shape. Mongol rule in the region eventually became the Ilkhanate, a dynasty that would develop its own court culture, bureaucracy, diplomacy, and patronage. But recovery is not reversal. A city can survive and still be permanently changed. The Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid, al-Mamun, translation movements, caliphal ceremony, and imperial imagination had already been fading before 1258. The Mongols did not destroy that golden Baghdad at its peak. They destroyed the city that still carried its name, its archives, its institutions, its prestige, and its claim to sacred political continuity. That is why the event became so devastating in memory. It was not only the deaths. It was the collapse of an idea. For centuries, Baghdad had represented the possibility that power, faith, law, commerce, and knowledge could gather around one imperial center. In 1258, that center failed to protect itself. Chapter 8: The Advisor Problem. Every great disaster looks for a traitor. This is almost a law of historical memory. When a catastrophe is too large to bear, people search for the hidden hand. Someone must have opened the gate. Someone must have lied. Someone must have betrayed the ruler. Someone must have sold the city. In the case of Baghdad, that figure was often Ibn al-Alqami, the vizier. Later Sunni accounts accused him of weakening the army, misleading the caliph, corresponding with the Mongols, and seeking revenge because of sectarian tensions in Baghdad. The story is powerful because it gives the disaster a face. It turns a complex collapse into a betrayal narrative. But we must be cautious. There had been sectarian violence in Baghdad. There were real tensions between Sunni and Shia communities. Ibn al-Alqami's position made him vulnerable to suspicion. And after the fall, later writers had powerful reasons to blame a Shia vizier for the ruin of the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate. That does not prove he was innocent of every political maneuver. Medieval courts were full of intrigue. Advisors corresponded. Factions plotted. Survival sometimes required private channels to enemy power. It is possible that Ibn al-Alqami sought negotiation or misjudged the Mongols. It is possible that he underestimated the consequences. It is possible that he acted in ways his enemies later exaggerated into treason. But the betrayal story is not enough. Even if Ibn al-Alqami gave bad advice, the caliph was still the ruler. Even if one advisor urged compromise, others urged defiance. Even if court politics were poisonous, the larger failure was strategic. Baghdad did not fall because one man whispered in one ear. It fell because the Abbasid state lacked the military power, diplomatic alliances, administrative urgency, and leadership clarity needed to face Hulegu. The traitor narrative is emotionally satisfying. But history is not required to satisfy emotion. The uncomfortable truth is that Baghdad did not need a single traitor to fall. It had enough weakness without one. Chapter 9: The Caliph's Mistake. So what was al-Musta'sim's fatal mistake? It was not simply that he refused Hulegu. Submission to the Mongols was humiliating, dangerous, and morally complex. Many rulers who submitted survived, but survival under Mongol authority came at a cost. It could mean tribute, hostages, military support, loss of independence, and the public admission that the caliph was no longer sovereign in any meaningful sense. Nor was the mistake simply that he chose resistance. Resistance can be honorable. Resistance can succeed. The Mamluks would soon prove that Mongol armies were not invincible when they defeated a Mongol force at Ain Jalut in 1260. That victory should not be inflated into a simple salvation story, and the Mongol force there was not the full army Hulegu had taken west. But it still mattered. It showed that Mongol expansion could be checked by disciplined leadership, strong cavalry, favorable conditions, and political will. So the idea that the Mongols could be resisted was not absurd in itself. The mistake was choosing neither path seriously. Al-Musta'sim did not submit early and fully enough to secure peace. He did not resist early and seriously enough to prepare victory. He did not create a coalition. He did not reform or concentrate the army effectively. He did not evacuate what could be saved. He did not turn Baghdad into a city ready for a long siege. He did not understand that Hulegu's demands were not ceremonial insults to be answered with ceremonial pride. They were imperial conditions backed by overwhelming force. This is why the Baghdad case remains so modern in its logic. States often fail not because leaders choose the wrong side of a clear binary, but because they try to preserve dignity without paying the cost of defense. They want the prestige of defiance and the safety of compromise. They want to insult the danger and negotiate with it later. They want to appear strong without becoming strong. They want time. But some enemies use your delay as preparation. Hulegu did. By the time Baghdad understood that the Mongols were not bluffing, the city was already inside the trap. Chapter 10: Hulegu's Calculation. Hulegu was not merely an agent of chaos. He was a conqueror with objectives. He wanted submission. He wanted territory. He wanted the Western campaign to demonstrate the reach of Mongol authority. He had already dealt with the Nizari Ismailis. Baghdad was the next great symbol. The destruction of Baghdad was therefore not random madness. It was political communication. That does not make it less brutal. It may make it more chilling. A massacre committed in rage is horrific. A massacre committed as policy is something colder. The Mongols understood fear as an instrument of empire. The sack of a resisting city could shorten the next siege. The destruction of one famous capital could save Mongol soldiers later by persuading other rulers to surrender. This logic appears again and again in imperial warfare across history. Punish one, frighten many. But in Baghdad, the logic carried special weight because of what the city represented. Hulegu was not simply defeating a local ruler. He was destroying the seat of a caliphate whose symbolic authority stretched across much of the Islamic world. The victory told every ruler in the region that Mongol power did not bow before sacred prestige. There were exceptions and protections during the sack, as there often were in medieval conquest. Some communities and individuals were reportedly spared because of Mongol policy, usefulness, patronage, or intercession. Hulegu's wife Doku's Khatun, a Christian, is often associated with protection extended to Christians. Scholars, craftsmen, merchants, administrators, and useful specialists might be spared in some contexts. Mongol violence was often selective as well as massive. This is another reason the event must be understood carefully. The sack was not a shapeless storm. It was conquest. It had categories. It had purposes. It had exceptions. It had rules, even if those rules were terrifying. To the victims, that distinction offered little comfort. The city still suffered. The caliph still died. Baghdad still became an example. Chapter 11: The World After Baghdad. The fall of Baghdad did not end the Mongol advance in the region. Hulegu's forces moved onward into Syria. Mongol power expanded further west. Cities and rulers faced the same terrible choice: submit, flee, resist, or negotiate. But history does not belong to one momentum forever. In 1260, at Ain Jalut, the Mamluks of Egypt defeated a Mongol army in Palestine. The battle did not destroy the Mongol Empire, and it should not be inflated into a simple story of sudden deliverance. Hulegu had withdrawn much of his main force eastward after the death of great Khan Mongol, and the army defeated at Ain Jalut was not the whole Mongol war machine. But the battle mattered. It checked Mongol expansion into Egypt and helped establish the Mamluks as the major defenders of the central Islamic lands against further Mongol pressure. The political center of gravity shifted. Cairo rose in prestige. The Mamluk Sultanate became the protector of a revived Abbasid Caliphate line in symbolic form. The Mongol Ilkhanate took shape in Iran and Iraq, eventually becoming deeply entangled with Persianate political culture, and over time, Islam itself. This is one of history's ironies. The conquerors who destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad did not remain outside the region's civilization forever. Their successors became patrons, rulers, converts, and participants in the world they had conquered. But that later transformation does not erase 1258. It only complicates it. History is not a morality play where destroyers remain destroyers and victims remain only victims. Conquest creates new mixtures. The Mongol world and the Islamic world did not simply collide and separate. They fused, fought, traded, intermarried, converted, and transformed each other. Yet for Baghdad, the memory of the sack remained a scar. Not because nothing came after, but because something irreplaceable had ended. The old Abbasid claim to universal leadership from Baghdad was gone. The city's aura was damaged. The map of authority had changed. The idea that the caliph's title alone could command the world had been exposed as illusion. Chapter 12, The Verdict. The case of Baghdad has many suspects. The Mongols are the direct destroyers. There is no way around that. Hulegu's army besieged the city, took it, looted it, killed on a massive scale, and executed the caliph. The brutality was real, even if later stories embroidered some details. The Mongol policy of exemplary violence turned Baghdad into a warning written in human lives. But if we ask why Baghdad was vulnerable, the verdict widens. Al-Musta'sim bears heavy responsibility. He was not responsible for the existence of the Mongol Empire. He did not create every weakness of the Abbasid state. He inherited a diminished caliphate, but he ruled at the decisive moment, and he failed the decisive test. He overestimated symbolic authority. He underestimated Mongol resolve. He failed to prepare adequately. He failed to choose a clear strategy. He mistook the memory of power for power itself. His advisors also bear responsibility, though not in the cartoonish form of a single betrayal. A divided court facing a unified enemy is already halfway defeated. Whether individual ministers were foolish, self-interested, cautious, ambitious, or treacherous, the collective result was failure. The broader Islamic political world bears a more diffuse responsibility. Baghdad's isolation was not only Baghdad's fault. Regional rulers had their own rivalries and fears. The caliph's prestige did not translate into common action. Fragmentation made the Mongol campaign easier. But we should not pretend that a perfect alliance was waiting to be born. The 13th century Middle East was not a modern nation-state system with a single command structure. It was a fractured landscape of dynasties, local interests, sectarian tensions, and survival calculations. Many rulers may have understood the danger and still chosen caution because caution seemed rational. This is how great centers fall. Not always because everyone hates them. Sometimes because everyone respects them just enough to mourn them, but not enough to risk everything for them. The verdict is therefore severe but layered. Hulegu destroyed Baghdad. Al-Musta'sim failed to save it. The Abbasid state had become too weak to defend the prestige it still claimed. And the surrounding world was too divided to rescue the city whose name it still revered. Chapter 13, The Last Lesson of Baghdad. The fall of Baghdad is often remembered as a civilizational death scene. A city of books burned, a river of ink, a caliph killed, a golden age ended. Those images endure because they speak to something emotionally true, even when they simplify the historical reality. But the deeper lesson is not that knowledge is fragile, though it is. It is not that empires fall, though they do. It is not even that the Mongols were terrifying, though they were. The deeper lesson is about the danger of inherited prestige. Baghdad's rulers lived inside a name that had once matched reality. The Abbasid Caliphate had once been a world power. Baghdad had once been the beating heart of that power. The caliph had once been a figure whose authority could shape continents. But time had changed the meaning of those symbols. The title remained. The memory remained. The ceremonies remained. The danger was that all of these could be mistaken for capacity. A palace can still glitter while the army decays. A ruler can still be praised while allies disappear. A city can still be sacred while its walls weaken. A state can still speak in the language of destiny after destiny has stopped listening. The Mongols did not create that illusion. They exposed it. And exposure in history can be as destructive as invasion. Baghdad in 1258 was not destroyed because it lacked history. It was destroyed because it had too much faith in history's protection. The city carried the weight of centuries, but weight is not armor. The Abbasid Caliph sat at the center of an old world of titles, memories, and sacred legitimacy, while outside the walls stood a new kind of imperial machine, mobile, disciplined, unsentimental, and brutally clear about what submission meant. The tragedy is that the caliph did not have to be a monster to lose everything. He only had to misunderstand the age he was living in. And that is why this case still feels alive. Every civilization has moments when it continues speaking with yesterday's confidence, while tomorrow's danger is already at the gate. Was Baghdad doomed by Mongol violence, Abbasid arrogance, political fragmentation, or the fatal comfort of believing that a great name can defend itself? Leave your verdict in the comments. And if you want more historical disasters reopened with the seriousness they deserve, subscribe to the History Docket. Because the next case may begin in another century, under another flag, with another ruler, but the question will be the same. When the warning signs were already visible, why did no one act in time?